Whether you're watching live or on replay, welcome. My name is Andrea Sampson, and I'm the CEO and founder of Talk Boutique and the Thought Leader Academy. And today we're going to talk about why it's important to be able to speak on stage as a thought leader. Many of the people I work with come to me with a little bit of a fear of getting on a stage, especially when we're talking to aspiring thought leaders. It can be one of the most daunting things to do to be up in front of a live audience. And that stage could be an auditorium of 10,000 people, but it could also be a boardroom full of 5 people because the fear is the same. The fear is actually the fear of being seen and being heard and valuing the content or the knowledge that you're putting out into that room. I know this firsthand. I've always been a fairly good speaker, and I've presented a lot in my career. I spent the first part of my career in advertising, and I used to be in front of boardrooms daily, sometimes several times a day. And that type of presenting really didn't make me that nervous. I got so comfortable doing it. It was easy for me. And of course, in a boardroom, you often have a PowerPoint presentation that you've worked on. But what happened for me was as I got more and more senior in my career, I started doing research and started becoming more of a thought leader. The information that I was conveying became more, I guess, subjective would be the best word. And subjective in that it was my own formulation of ideas. So I would have done research, and I had facts and data that supported it. But what I was doing was pulling it all together, creating lateral thinking, and being able to come up with a conclusion or an outcome based upon what the data was telling me. And I had to tell a story with what I had learned. And I wasn't really all that comfortable with it back in those days. No one had ever taught me storytelling to begin with. And I was a pretty good storyteller in general, but building a story from facts is a very different thing. And then secondly, I now needed to be able to do that in a way that other people would understand. So I had to build a story with facts and data and convey it in a way that was both interesting and memorable, but also believable and contextual. And that was hard. And sometimes I was okay at it, and other times it was only okay. I had to learn. And it wasn't really until I started working in the TED world that I really learned storytelling. Now, what had happened for me, though, along with my discomfort with having to be able to make stories out of facts and data, was that I had a really bad situation with somebody I worked with, where this person was the owner of an agency. And for whatever reason, he decided to be unkind in front of a live audience. It was very difficult. In fact, I was very humiliated. And it became more and more difficult for me to get up in front of a room. And I started having panic attacks when I had to do that, which was not great because I was presenting all the time. And if you've ever experienced panic attacks, the problem with it is you don't know when they're going to come and when they're not. And so it got very bad for me. And I had to relearn how to actually be in front of an audience. And so the work that I was doing at the time with TEDx Toronto, I was helping other people get on stages, but I really didn't see myself as a thought leader. And I really didn't think that I would ever be on a public stage again as a thought leader telling stories. I did it in front of boardrooms, and it was really hard. But for me to get on a public stage, I didn't think was going to be possible. And I had to learn how to overcome that nervousness. And the good news is I get on public stages all the time now. I have overcome it. But how did that happen? How did I overcome it? Well, I started taking lessons from myself. I was teaching others how to do this all the time. And what I was teaching them how to do was to learn how to, first of all, trust their own voice. And you see, the first thing about getting over your nerves is knowing what you're going to say. When I look back to the work that I was doing in advertising, because we were doing more presentations, yes, I had a PowerPoint slide or whatever it was that was going to be used as a backdrop. And I sort of used that as a bit of a crutch. But when you're on a public stage, you don't have that same level of support in the slides or scripts that are on a screen. And so I had to learn how to write my talks. And that was something I was teaching others to do. I had come up with and had worked on something we call the talk canvas, which is a powerful tool for thought leaders to be able to use in the work that they do. The talk canvas is a narrative outlining tool. And that tool starts with your core idea. What is it you want your audience to take away? It then it breaks down that core idea into its component parts into 3 key messages. Within those key messages, it has supports and takeaways. That's the data. So the core idea, the 3 key messages, and the ways in which those messages break down, and then the takeaways from each of those messages are the data. Once that's identified, then you build story around that so that that data now becomes a story. So for me, as I was teaching my clients how to do that, I was learning it for myself as well. I knew that that was the way in which to convey story and data, but I had to take a lesson from myself. And so I started writing my own talks in the same way. And the very first talk that I wrote many years ago using that format was a eulogy for my father. Eulogies are something that, are difficult. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, I need to do this. And I needed to be able to tell stories about my father in a way that actually held something bigger. You see, my relationship with my father wasn't always great. And when he died, we weren't estranged, but we certainly weren't close. I had been living in another city for many, many years. And my father, who had many emotional issues and addiction issues, he had changed and he had overcome many of them. But because we weren't close in proximity, we never really got to know each other in ways that would have helped with our relationship. So when he died, it was difficult for me because we had never had that moment of being able to reconcile. He unfortunately had gotten cancer. Once his diagnosis had been confirmed, we were given a period of time that he was going to live. And I made plans to come home within a couple of weeks of that diagnosis. And unfortunately, he died. He literally died as I was in transit. I was in the air. And so we never got to reconcile in a way that was helpful for us. My family, none of them wanted to do the eulogy. It's a hard thing. And everyone looked at me. Here I was teaching people how to do public speaking and said, well, you should do this. And I remember saying no. And I said no many times. It was probably maybe a month before we had decided to do a celebration of life. So my father had died in November. We made the decision to wait to do a celebration of life for him the following summer because he wanted his ashes scattered at sea. I'm originally from the east coast of Canada. My father is from Cape Breton, and he wanted his ashes to be in the sea where he was born. And so about a month before that, I had been working with speakers, and this was early on. This was in 2016. So we had just opened the company. And so I had been working with a few speakers, and we had developed the talk canvas. About a month before his celebration of life, I remember waking up at about 3:00 in the morning, and literally the entire talk came to me in a talk canvas format, the idea, then the messages, and then the stories. And I remember hearing it in my mind And I remember thinking to myself, no, I'm not doing it. I was adamant that I was not going to do this eulogy, that I was not the right person, that someone else in my family should do it. They were closer to my father. My father and I hadn't really had a relationship in many, many years, and it wasn't the thing for me to do. Well, after the third day of being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning with this full eulogy in my mind, I made the decision to write it down. I was like, all right, Dad, I hear you. I know you want me to do this. So I'll write it down, but I am not going to promise that I'm going to do it. One of the things that we teach when we're using the talk canvas is that you write it down in the talk canvas format. And then what you do is you take sort of 3x5 note cards, or you could use Post-it notes. It's up to you, but little note cards. And you then transcribe what you've put in the talk canvas onto those note cards. And that gives you a way to actually learn your talk. So I did that. I wrote it down in my talk canvas, and then I took it and I put it onto note cards. And I put it aside and was like, all right, it's there. I'm not sure that I'm going to give this, but I've written it down. And over the next 5 or 6 weeks leading up to that celebration of life, those note cards sat beside me. And I kept thinking to myself, look, I've just started a company. My father has just died. I didn't have a great relationship. I actually wasn't able to be there in his final moments. I'm not the right person. I had every excuse. And of course, I also had this fear of public speaking, this fear that I was going to have a panic attack and go into a complete, sort of loss of breath and shaking and all of the things and faint on stage, because these are all things that would happen to me in a panic attack. And so I every now and then would pick up my little deck of 3x5 note cards and I would look at it, and I might even say it out loud a couple of times. I was rehearsing it. I wasn't acknowledging to myself I was rehearsing it, but I was. And when the day finally came and I was in Cape Breton with my family, who were still all saying to me, "This is you," and I was still saying, "I'm not promising." And when the officiant said, who will be saying a few words, I found myself standing up and walking up to the podium with my little deck of cards. And I proceeded to give the eulogy from memory. What I learned in that moment about myself, about my father, but also about public speaking, we need to understand the thing it is we want to convey first. And we need that thing it is we want to convey to be meaningful to us as the speaker. And when we have an idea, because that's what that is, even when you're doing a eulogy, when you have it outlined and you know what it is, it gives you a North Star to come back to. Because the nerves that we feel them because we care about our audience, because we want our audience to take something away from the talks and the presentations we're giving. And we fear and don't trust that we as ourselves are able to do that in a way that's valuable for that audience. And so by having that core idea identified and knowing how it breaks down into its component parts, what we've done is we've given ourselves a map of the information we want to convey. And when we identify a story that can hold that information, that data, what we've done is we've given ourselves something to connect to that we emotionally want to convey to that audience that will hold that idea. And so for me, in doing my father's eulogy, what I learned was that I can actually be in front of an audience because I had an idea. I had the story. I had the emotional connection. And I was able to tell the stories that I told about my father genuinely and authentically. And I was able to convey a really important message that the people who were there mourning my father and who knew my father were able to get to know him a little bit better. And I got to know him a little bit better. As humans, we are all complex beings. And what we do in life is reflected in those around us. And for my father, he was very complex. He had mental issues that were covered up by many different addictions and anger issues. But I learned to love him and to see him as a whole human by seeing his life through the lens of an idea. And so when we're nervous to stand in front of an audience, ask yourself first, what is it you want that audience to take away? What's the idea that you want to convey? And that's not an easy question to ask yourself because often we struggle with that. So give yourself the time to be able to break that down, get it out on paper, get it out with other people, talk about it. When you think you've got it, write it down. Start talking to other people about it, not on stages, just in general conversation. Here's what I'm thinking about talking about, and tell them your idea. Get feedback. Once you've got that, then break it into its component parts and then find a story. Now, once you have all of that, then you can start rehearsing it. Stand. Have your little note cards like I did. Tell the stories that hold the idea. You're going to find your whole body changes. Why? Because you've got something to say. Nerves often come from the fact that we don't trust in ourselves, that we have something valuable to say, and that we'll remember what it is we want to say. So when you've done the work, identified your idea, done the rehearsal, and know your story, the nerves start to fall away. It doesn't mean they go completely. You still, you walk out onto stage, whether that stage is the front of a boardroom or the front of an auditorium, and you get hit with a whole bunch of energy from that audience. And of course, what happens is our brain goes into fight, flight, or fright or freeze mode, right? That is just all of us. Doesn't matter who you are. We all get that moment. It is a hit of adrenaline. You can choose to freeze, which is what happens when we're nervous, right? We completely freeze in place. And so if you know that that's going to happen to you by having your content already well organized and well rehearsed, and knowing what it is you're going to open with, especially if it's a story, in that moment of freezing, the only thing you need to remember is your opening line. And if you remember that one thing, which most of us will, the rest will come. So doing the rehearsal, so you've got that one opening line ready to go. And when you have that moment is a whole lot easier. Also, another great tip, if you're really nervous when you are going to go out on a stage, because you are going to get hit with a whole hit of adrenaline like that, like we all do. Like I said, that's just the way our body works. That's a mechanical thing within our body. So knowing you're going to get hit with adrenaline, there's two really easy things that you can do before you walk out onto that stage. And I want you to start doing these 24 hours before you start walking out onto that stage. Number one, breathe. Just do lots of breathing exercises. I know that sounds, like, well, of course I'm going to breathe. I breathe all the time. I wouldn't be alive if I didn't breathe. Yes, and you need to do deep breaths. So what you're doing is oxygenating your system. And before you walk out onto stage, like when you're standing backstage or in the background, just start doing some box breathing, which is you breathe for 4 beats in through your nose, hold for 4, breathe out through your mouth for 4, hold for 4. So breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold, breathe in, and do that at least 4 to 6 times. That brings your body what you need, because when we're nervous, we stop breathing. We breathe really shallowly, and that actually increases the adrenaline and it increases that hit. So number 1, breathe. Number 2, drink water. Water is really important. You see, when we're hit with adrenaline, if we're in a dehydrated state, that adrenaline is even stronger. It hits us more. So 24 hours before you're going to go on stage, Start drinking lots of water. You want your system to be really well hydrated. Now, that said, stop drinking a lot of water about an hour before you go on stage, because the worst thing you can do is go on stage and realize that you need to go to the washroom. So make sure that you finish your water drinking at least an hour before, and make sure you go to the washroom before you go on stage. But those two things are really easy ways just to help manage that hit of adrenaline that's going to come, and it's going to come for everyone. And that is the sort of some of my top tips on how to manage your nerves when you're, thinking about being a thought leader. Because here's the reality. You have something that the world needs to know. Our respective areas of expertise through a different lens. Each of us has a life that is different from the other. And because of that, we create context for the work that we do and for the ideas that we have. When you choose to not share your message, you're denying us the ability to understand your message in a way that we couldn't have without your context. So we need you. We need your voice to be part of the thought leadership that is creating or co-creating the future for us. You may think that your voice won't go very far or doesn't have a lot of impact, but that's not true. You never know how far your voice is going to go or how much impact you have. When we choose to share it, it gets out into the world. And look, we've never had an easier way to be able to share our voice than we do right now. I'm sharing my voice and my stories with you right now. I've just created my own YouTube channel, and I've created my own social media platforms. You can do the same. Use these platforms to help you practice so that when you're ready to go on a stage, it's not the first time you're saying it. And say it out loud often and get lots of feedback. And as you get that feedback, change it. Try it again, because sharing your message is absolutely one of the most important things you will do. To get you started, have a look at the description box below. I'm going to put a couple of things in the description box. The first is a workbook on mindset, helping you to look at your mindset a little bit differently. And the second thing is the Talk Canvas framework. We're going to give you that as well. So use the mindset workbook and use the Talk Canvas. These two things are going to help you understand what it is that is holding you back from telling your story and helping you to outline that story so you're able to practice it in a way so that you can show up with confidence when you're sharing your story and your idea. Make sure to like this video, and I'll see you in our next video right here.